I'm just going to share my screen. Can someone let me know if they can see that? Is that a
Not
yes?
yet. No, not
Not
yet.
yet.
We're still seeing your face.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
sorry,
unfortunate. Okay, I think I might have accidentally clicked the stop sharing somehow. So let's try this again. Share screen. Okay,
Yes, we can see the screen.
perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to do an introduction to Fire AU Cool. First off, I wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. And we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, acknowledging the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators and healers. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. So what we're going to cover off today, a really brief bit on what has sparked, and then go into all about AU Core, doing a bit of the introduction here. Some of this will be quite technically focused on what are the different parts of the implementation guide, having a bit of a look into a profile and what does it say and how to have a look at that. And it'll also talk about AU Base versus AU Core, because this is something that comes up a lot, which is entirely reasonable. They both have very sort of similar sounding names and they are very closely linked. And then if we have time, I'll do an update on where we are with Fire AU Core and how you can contribute. This session is scheduled for an hour and a half. I want to talk for hopefully less than 45 minutes and leave the rest of that for conversations, discussions, questions, maybe going into anything in more detail if there's something that people have noticed that they want to dive into further. So let's go on to Spark. So Spark is the Australian National Fire Accelerator. What that really means is Spark is a community. So that's bringing together government, technology vendors, provider organisations, research organisations, peak bodies, individual practitioners, individual domain experts to come together to accelerate the creation and use of national fire standards in healthcare information exchange. So this is started by the Department of Health and Aged Care in partnership with HL7 Australia, with the Australian Digital Health Agency and with CSIRO. And so this is a government-funded, government-initiated and funded 2-year program of work at the moment. It's working collaboratively also with international work groups and looking to harmonise across international standards. We're starting with and intending to focus on the high priority national use cases. So our high priority national use cases here are an AU Core, and we'll talk about what that is today, but also the AU e-requesting project. There'll be sessions in some future that will be covering off an introduction to AU e-requesting. That's really just started, but today's focus is on what we call AU Core. And that project has in it not just the Fire AU Core, which is today's subject, but also what we call an AU CDI, or the Australian Dataset for Interoperability. We're also intending to go through validation piloting of this to test that whatever standardization we are discussing is tested, that this is implementable, that it is imposing the right kind of standardization and with the outcomes that we're looking for. There'll also be some test data, synthetic data and services built out to support those, to continue adoption and testing against that as people look to develop and implement against it. And there'll also be some terminology work. Now, a number of organisations have put their hand up to be founding members of Sparked. I've just got a screenshot really from the Confluence page, but I've linked up to the right. And I should probably say at this point that these slides will be made available. So at the end of this session on our Confluence site, we will have the materials there Michael or someone else from the AU Core Technical Design Group, if you could pop into the chat the link to where all the recording sessions are so that people can copy that now that they'll get to it. Because from a mailing list perspective, I only have the AU Core Technical Design Group people I can contact. I won't be able to email everyone who's joined this presentation because it's an open presentation. Anyone with the Zoom link can come and attend. But I'd like to make sure you actually get the slides. So,
Okay.
with that done about Spark, let's actually talk about the fire portion of AU Core. And I'm actually going to start with, why do we even have Australian fire specifications? In fire is an international standard. Now, it's well developed, and you don't actually need fire profiles or specific fire IGs in order to use fire. You can just use, I guess, profileless fire. What the fire standard does is it has the 80-20 rule. So it has focused on the 20% of the requirements that solve 80% of the interoperability needs of the use cases, and it leaves the rest of that off to local jurisdictional implementation guides, to specific vendor implementation guides, or just up to systems to work out how they're going to do something that isn't covered by the fire IG. And so that brings us to, well, that's not enough to be really clear about how we operate in Australia. We've got a number of needs around billing and funding. We've got our legislative requirements. We have Australian specific terminology. We have a number of identifiers. So just in a use case on how do we do something day to day in a use case in digital health, there's more information than what the fire standard itself just offers. So if we're going to define things and have agreement at a national level, we need Australian standards that do that. And the first place we come to here is the AU Base Fire Implementation Guide. And what that did is where we started with fire way back in, I think, early 2016, late 2015, is when this new kind of awesome looking web-based standard fire came along. We wanted to look at how do we adopt that in Australia. And I think one of the first places we started was something like a patient. How do we represent, or how do we use and exchange patient information in Australia? And we immediately went, well, how do I do an IHI? How do I do a Medicare card number? And so we started to define those. And that is where AU Base work started. And that's what's continued as we build out and add on sort of the toolkit to fire in what can you do and how can you represent that in fire in Australia. If you're familiar with fire, but maybe not so familiar with AU Base, then you could think of this like the THO's terminology IG mixed with maybe the extension pack put together. And that's at the Australian level, that's where we bring in these concepts where people could use them if they need to. And that was where we started. And that's really good, but it doesn't actually tell us how to solve a specific problem. If we have a use case and we want to retrieve a set of allergies for a patient, well, we've gone and we've added to fire what could we do, but what are we actually doing? What do I need to do in order to request that information? What will I get back? Can I use that? What terminology are they actually using? And that's where we start to come into the other implementation guides around AU Core. And going further than that, some of our infrastructure and use case fire implementation guides, which will call out for a specific use case. I mean, AU e-requesting is going to be a prime example of that, as is provider directory. But for this case, this is what you need to do. And so from an AU, we've got the split there between AU Core in green and the infrastructure and use case fire implementation guides in blue. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. We've got a specification architecture in HL7AU on how this sits. And we start with fire, and where we need a concept that maybe that's Australian Indigenous status, then we add what that could be and make an agreement in AU Base. But if we're going to use this, and we have a lot of use cases in Australia, as does everyone across the world, what we came to when we were discussing this is, do I really need to redefine the core parts of how we're trying to solve this every single time? Do I need to redefine what a patient is, how to find a patient, what is a patient name on every single use case we do? And none of us really wanted to face that. So we were looking to define a consistent and standard data model, and to look to define the behavior on how does systems interact around that in what we call AU Core. And the idea there is that we would be defining these, and then we could then reuse it in all our use cases, because we would have already done that work and defined it in FHIR. We don't need to have the conversation about patient addresses and patient name, and do you support a prefix or a suffix, again, because we have a standard implemented agreement on what does that look like and how to use it. So we can focus on the use case, which is coming up here, requesting, or if we wanted to solve things like adverse event reporting, on what are the requirements left? What else do we need to do? So I guess I've got another slide here on AU Base and AU Core, and I've covered most of that, where AU Base adds to the toolkit, hence the hammer icon, whereas AU Core starts to build something, as does e-requesting or any of the other use cases. They define what we will do. And so those standards, and that includes AU Core, will have things like a data structure and define the RESTful API interactions. In AU Core sense, we're having that core data structure, which is going to be informed by the Australian core data set for interoperability. We're going to define the RESTful interactions for setting those minimum expectations for systems to do things like record or update or search or retrieve what is that core digital health and administrative information. What that looks like in a FHIR sense is a set of profiles and a set of capability statements that define what those are. And we use must support to say these are the parts, these are the labeled parts of the FHIR standard that form what we're talking about when we're talking about that core data. So we're looking for AU Core to be used by Australian stakeholders when they're implementing FHIR, and to reuse this, and if possible, directly reuse exactly what is being done, so that we can keep going with that interoperability definition and reducing that time to market. We should also be building on top of AU Core where we have any specific use cases, things we're trying to solve, any proof of concepts, but also working out what our own use cases, workflows, and other projects are. So that's all very well and good, but what is AU Core? So it's an implementable standard. It's for FHIR-based interfaces. It's not just for provider, or it also includes patient. I think we also will need to adjust that, likely to say registries. It is the exchange standard for AU CDI, that common data model that is being defined. That is being worked on through the clinical design group that is part of SPARKed, but I won't be going into detail on that today. And it includes data model and your RESTful API. So this is useful in many interactions. Why this should be easy to implement, and then we can reuse. And it should not require redevelopment or refactoring in order to incorporate new projects, new capabilities, new features. So what does that look like when I'm not just giving a sort of a dry definition? We're looking to, especially in R1, address the foundational parts of some of the common problems. Those things that we want to solve at a national level that causes integration effort, and some of the things that are expensive, where if we get them wrong, or if we need to do them differently for multiple partners, are time-consuming, are expensive, and cause wastage. So these are some things like the ability to find available records for a patient held in a system in Australia, just to do things like searching and retrieving what we're considering the core digital health or administrative data. There's some examples there. It's not exhaustive. but it is looking at things like allergies and immunizations, medications, conditions. There'll be some social determinants of health, and also looking to support submitting that content. Now, I'm about here going to start going into some of the more technical parts of how we do that in a FIRE-RG. I should probably break to ask if there are any questions at this point. And if there are, you can put your hand up using the Zoom reactions. All right, I'll head on. So if we're going to be addressing these common parts here, we do that through those two things, the data model. And the data model gets represented through what we call profiles and extensions. And I've just sort of fudged and listed terminology there. They are value sets, code systems, and to a certain degree, concept maps. And these define the rules the data conforms to. The other part of this is the RESTful API, and that's the rules for obtaining that data. And we define a RESTful API in FIRE-RG through capability statements, we do it through operations, and we also do it through search parameters. So when we look at some of those things I was talking about around what we call discovery or search, AUCall will say you can search for a patient using IHI or Medicare or DVA. And this is the old copy of the slide. This should not have the word passport on it, by the way. So just take this as an example, not what AUCall actually says at the moment, since this is old. But you can search for a patient using an Australian identifier. Those ones in particular where listing is supported at the moment in AUCall, and gender and birth date. And when you do that, the type of response you'll get, moving into that second box, is it'll return a patient record with demographics. There's a note in brackets there that this may or may not be suppressed, because we need to understand that not all systems will have the permissions to access all the demographics of data. And that is also something that's talked about in AUCall about what should that look like. And the content of that response will have things like it'll include the identifiers, it'll have gender, it'll have date of birth. It might include things like birthplace. It might include the Indigenous status. It might include address. It might include telecom. And if we go beyond that into something that's more of a clinical use case, so in that second line, we've got in discovery, looking at searching for diagnostic results. There's actually two kinds of searches pulled out there. So one is, let's find diagnostic results by, I have a lab number and I have something about the patient, so patient ID. Or you could say, what I actually have is I want to search for diagnostic results, and I want to do that by the patient. I want to do that by the type of diagnostic result. For example, here lists cardiology, could be pathology, could be diagnostic imaging. And I'm going to give you a date range, because I only want to see the results for that patient and type, but filtered to be something like the last month, for example. And so that's the type of data you would get back. You would either, if you'd search for the first one, the specific diagnostic results that match the lab number and the patient, or you would get all the current and historical that match the date range for that patient and for the type of result. And the kind of data you get back, according to AUCall, would have things like the test name, and it would have the date of the test, the status of the test, who performed the test, may include the results like the value itself and any order details. And that's really what we're looking at defining in AUCall and how it gets used to have an agreement on how do systems interact with each other. What is the data model? What are the rules for obtaining the data? How can I ask for something? What do I get back? So let's go into the FIRE-RG itself. So I've linked here, this is a slightly older version, but I've not gone through and updated this. We're now on 030 because the example I'm using in the slides is basically the same. So a FIRE-RG starts with a homepage. A fire implementation guide is essentially a website, and it's there with a number of links that you navigate through the top on what you might be interested in seeing, whether that's about conformance. If you need to look at the guidance on how to implement that, there's guidance in there around how to support medicines coding. And then you get into your fire artifacts, which we've just talked about on this slide, about profiles, extensions, terminology, capability statements, operations and search parameters. You get to those by on that top bar, there's a drop down from fire artifacts. And then we have examples, which provide examples for every resource profile, for every profile we have in this implementation guide. And there's a series of downloads at the end, which let you take a local copy of this web page. And they also have all sorts of awesome things like an NPM package that you can load on a Fire server if you want to actually start trying to load up and try to test against AU Core. So the fire artifacts we have in AU Core are profiles. We have a series of AU Core profiles. Now, I've done a strike through for extensions, and I've done that because we don't define extensions in AU Core. We do those in AU Base. We'll reference them in the profiles, just like the Fire standard itself publishes a series of internationally recognized extensions. If we're looking to define extensions in the context of AU Core, as in things that should be supported at a national level, we define those in AU Base because that's its point, is to be that holistic definition of what are the Australian use film concepts. And then we would say that it needs to be supported. We expect it to exist. We want to be able to search by it, or we want to be able to get it back using an AU Core profile to do that. And then on the terminology side, in the AU Core AG, we have value sets, ones that AU Core itself defines. A lot of those are published in the National Clinical Terminology Service, as opposed to the IG itself, but they're linked in the profiles. What we haven't done at the moment, and I think will also be the case for extensions, is we haven't defined any code systems. And I would expect us not to do so. The purpose of AU Core is a core set of data for Australia. And that suggests to me that all that terminology, if we need a code system, should be defined in AU Base. It's reasonable to have value sets because they constrain a set of terminology to, for this purpose, for this exchange, we want only these values. But to define the terminology in and of itself through a code system, I think belongs in AU Base. And we've not come across yet a case that says, no, it should be in AU Core. We'll continue to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. There are also search parameters. There's a really limited set of search parameter definitions provided in HL7 Australia. And the less we can do of them, the better. It looks like we probably won't have to do too much in future because it seems that the Fire standard is moving to provide standardized search parameters for its extensions. But at the moment, there are only defined search parameters. So coming back to this example, if I want to search for a patient using an IHI, I use a search parameter to let me do that. And that's defined in the Fire standard. What AU Core does is say, no, you need to be able to support using an IHI to do that. But Fire defines what even is that parameter that could be used. How should systems interact with that search parameter? But in R4, which is the version of Fire we use, they have not defined search parameters for any of the extensions. So where an extension is proposed to be supported in a search sense, we've needed to define what is that in AU Core. It's a very limited set, and we'll go through and refine those in the technical design group if any of that is kept. Last part is their operations and capability statements. At this point in time, there are no operations, so I'm not covering them in AU Core. This is particularly not in this presentation. It's not come up yet. If we need to develop something on top of the fire standard that defines behaviour then we will define an operation. It's probably not very likely for R1, but we'll see. The last bit is the capability statements. So coming back to this table again, on our RESTful API, so the search parameters, we either adopt from the fire standard or we define ourselves. The capability statements themselves are the key part of defining the RESTful API. They say what is allowed, shall we support search? Shall we support search by these parameters? That you must return results that conform to a particular profile. All of that is handled in a capability statement. So setting the obligations on a system, we define a series of actors and bundle up a series of requirements so that we can say that a client, like an app, needs to behave in this way in order to allow for this kind of behavior, and a server, which will be responding to that app with the data back, needs to behave in this way in order to meet these requirements. So let's have a look at a profile. And a profile has 4 parts to it in AU Core at the moment. So we've got some informative text and then some profile-specific guidance. So the informative text at the top says, well, what is this profile for? In this case, we've taken the example of AU Core condition. And so this is the minimum expectations on a condition resource. It also makes it clear in the definition that it's built off AU base condition, and it defines what else is additional to be supported and that shall be present in order to meet AU Core's requirements. It's got some information on usage scenarios. That's quite generic at this stage. It does say we've got supported usage scenarios for querying and for recording or updating. It calls out some of the comparison to relevant national and international specifications. I'm not sure if we'll get time to talk about that today, but what we are keeping in mind as we're building out AU Core is the relationship between the work we're doing and US Core and International Patient Access, aka IPA, and International Patient Summary, aka IPS. So those 3 are of particular relevance. They're certainly not the only things that we look at in our space as we intend to harmonise with international standards and look at how we adopt them in Australia. And that work also needs to come through AU Core since it is defining what the minimum requirements are in Australia. And then lastly, we've got some profile-specific implementation guidance. So this is where we've got some helpful information to describe maybe the use of an element or to give some guidance on how to fill it out, depending on there are particular scenarios. We can see what's being shown there is some information around what does the condition category element do and why it is helpful, and to also provide some description around coding and some information on what is recommended good practice on how to deal with and populate the code part of a condition resource. I'll move on to the next part. So then we have formal views of profile content. I've taken a snapshot here. On the formal views for AU Core, you'll see several tabs. So there's a differential table, there's a key elements table, there's a snapshot table, and then there are statistics / references and all. It is recommended that you look at the key elements table. Because AU Core is built in such a way that it builds on the work that we're doing in AU Base, what the key elements table will do is show you some of that further information. The differential table will only show you what did we add specifically in AU Core, but it won't show you everything that is required that we've inherited from AU Base, including all the terminology. It also won't show you what the rules are that we inherit from the fire standard. So if fire sets in the standard something to be mandatory, if you look at just the differential table tab, you wouldn't even see that an element is mandatory. So you need to look at least the key elements table, which will highlight anything that has a constraint on it, what the terminology requirements are, and bring in everything that is labeled must support. So that's therefore forming part of the data model, that core data model in AU Core. I'll put a warning here at the moment that, do we have Dushika on the line? I'm not sure if the constraints on invariants are coming through.
I'm here. Hi, everyone. Yes, that's been changed and constraints should be coming through, but they differ between different tabs. So differential tab will only show constraints that are defined or changed in that profile. Key elements table tab will only show constraints on key elements displayed in the table, and then the snapshot table will include all constraints.
Okay, thank you. So the snapshot table, which I've not shown here, includes everything sitting behind the fire resource. So what we've got in AU Core and we've labeled must support are the things that we say, these are the things that are the requirements that we have in AU Core. And there's much more sitting behind that in the fire standard. And the snapshot table will show you everything. And sometimes you might need to look at that, but you really want to start at the key elements table. And that will therefore show you what the elements are on the left, underneath the name column. That flag, you want to pay a special attention to the red boxes with the S in it, which is the must support flag. That indicates the elements that form part of AU Core. The cardinality lists the allowed occurrences. So 0, ... at the very top, and then 0, ... as in 0 is optional. There may be 0 to 1 occurrences of this, where star is indicating, or asterisk is indicating a many. Then there's the type column, some of which is set in AU Core. And then we have our summary of the descriptions and constraints. So it should be understood that this view is a nice summary view on what those key elements are. There are more detailed views if you click through to any of those elements that will go into detail. And certainly if you were to click on one of the bindings, which is a binding to a value set. So if we looked at the clinical status element, which is bound to condition clinical status codes, and that would then go in and describe what that value set is. What are the codes that are allowed? And if you were to click on the word required in those brackets, that will describe what does required mean and how do you need to use it. So one of the great advantages of a fire implementation guide, especially as the web pages, is that all of these are clickable links and they will go into further detail on what do you actually need to do in order to implement that. And the last part of a profile is the search. So at the bottom, so this is still scrolling down, below the formal views of the profile, there'll be this section that's currently called notes, which is a very uninformative heading. I think we should change that. And that summarizes what the search requirements are for that profile. And it lists the parameters, therefore, on the left, and what your conformance is. So what's shall, what's should, what's may. We do include mays. The mays are included because there's some items that we want to highlight their potential relevance to people. They should not ignore or miss the fact that these parameters exist. And then there's some more detailed requirements there on the right on how to, or what the further constraints are on the search parameter type. And below that, we then list examples. So we try to show an example and further information around what is the mandatory search parameters and the combination of the search parameters, and also into the shoulds. We've not bothered doing that for the maize, but only for the shells and shoulds at the moment, that provide some examples of what do the queries look like and what would come back, but using natural language to say what would we expect to be returned if a server responded to that query. So I've got now, what are the differences then? Looking at the FHIR resource itself, what would that look like in AU base? And then what do we do in AU core? Again, continuing the condition resource example. So FHIR's R4 condition resource looks like this. If you go and navigate to the FHIR standard, this is what you'll see. So you'll see things like condition identifiers and clinical status and a whole number of things that are optional. It will define a series of terminology, it has some data types in it. And when we looked at how do we work with conditions in Australia, and we had the conversation in an AU-based sense, and we agreed on what is it in Australia that we do differently than the international standard. And that amounted solely to terminology. So there's some preferred terminology here, which lines up with the reference sets published from the National Clinical Terminology Service in Australia. And this is where we've landed in a AU-based condition profile, that the only differences between this FHIR resource is that we have some preferred reference sets for use when describing this terminology. And that is what is defined in the AU-based condition published in the AU-based FHIR IG. When we came to doing AU core, and we're looking at what are those minimum requirements, what are the elements that have to be supported? Here's all the potential things that are supported. Layered on with some Australian terminology, what are our actual requirements here? What are we going to say has to be supported? Is there anything we're going to change the cardinality of that is optional, be mandatory? What are the search parameters, the behaviour that we are proposing needs to be supported in order to exchange condition information? And so this is what AU core condition looks like. I've only shown the differential view because if I showed the key elements, it gets a lot bigger. So you'll now see must support. So these are all the elements that are currently proposed for support in the AU core R1. You may also note, if you've got keen eyes, that we have mandated 2 elements that were previously optional. So condition category and condition code now have a minimum cardinality of 1 rather than optional. So if I come back to even this page where you see condition code as 0.1, that's optional. You can instantiate a condition resource but not include a code. In an AU core sense, for our use cases, we're saying, no, you need to say what this condition is. There is no point exchanging a condition resource if you cannot describe what the condition is. The other things that have been done here is there's now business rules. Those are in the top right. You'll now see descriptions and constraints. There's this thing with bolded that says AU-core-COND-05, that a clinical status shall be present if verification status is not entered in error. So that's a data quality rule that's been proposed and is in the AU core profile, which sets some rules around what does the data have to do. So we can do behavioural, not just conditional. We can say that if this is present, then this other thing must be present. We've also changed some of that terminology, and we've changed the strength of the terminology. So coming down to condition code, and you will see then, if you look across, that there is that National Clinical Terminology Services reference set, where the binding has a URL. So that's healthterminologies.gov.au/FHIR/value set/conditional clinical condition -1. And we've set that here to be extensible. And in AU base, that is set at preferred, which is a weaker strength. Essentially, what we're proposing the difference is in condition code, that's more like it's a recommendation. We would like you to do this. There are no warnings, there are no errors if you do not supply a code there. In fact, a code from that particular set of values. In AU Core, what is proposed is we have this reference set, this agreed national reference set, comes from SNOMED, SNOMED CTAU, and the proposed binding is extensible, which says if you are exchanging or you are trying to define a particular condition, be that diabetes, be that a more specific kind of diabetes, what you need to do is you need to use that value set, the code from that value set, if the concept you're trying to say has a code in that value set. And the reason that's left open is that, well, sometimes there are new things, there are things that don't exist in that nationally defined reference set that match what is trying to be entered into the system, or that are out of date. We might have legacy data, things where the concepts from some time ago have now been deprecated or made inactive in SNOMED, and it's still meaningful to exchange that information from a legacy sense. And so that binding extensible allows that, but it is a stronger binding to say you really need to be using one of the codes from this value set unless it is some exceptional circumstance. The other thing we do here is change is point to other profiles. So the condition resource also has a patient, which is handled by the subject element. So looking down the condition resource, close to the bottom of the page is a subject, and that's the patient. And we say that that subject needs to conform to the AU Core patient profile. We also do that for Encounter. And that's an example of the kinds of rules we're setting in AU Core condition. So when we get the bigger key elements view, and that sort of shows where we are in terms of our agreement of what is supported. At this stage, honestly, there's not that much that we haven't put a must support on. I think we need to refine that further, but that's some of the work we're taking through the technical design group at the moment. And I've been talking about conforming for some time, and it's worth making clear that there are two different ways to implement AU Core. There's a data model in AU Core indicated by the must support elements and those profiles that define the rules on the data. And you may implement AU Core with profile only support. So you're just saying those resources as profiled by AU Core are what your digital health information conforms to. They're how you represent digital health information. The other thing, being the rules to obtain the data defined through a RESTful API, is that you can implement beyond just profile support, but profile plus interaction support. So that is the resources that are profiled, plus the RESTful API that's defined in our capability statements, which I think leads me on to, oh, perfect, capability statements. We have two in AU Core, especially in AU Core R1, where we're defining a set of resource profiles that say, here's what the data looks like. And we're defining the RESTful API on how to obtain that data through a client-server architecture. So those two are defined. They're currently in AU Core, looking for feedback, where the client is the basic rules on how do I search for things, how do I ask for things, and the server has those rules on them. What do I need to respond back with? What kind of queries do I need to be able to accept? And what does my response look like? And then there are rules back on the client with, if I get that response and it is a valid response, conforms to the rules, then I have some obligations that I need to be able to process that. I can't throw an error and fall over and not be able to do anything. So I'm going to try and skim through this a little bit quickly, noting I'm coming down to some time limits here. Well, I want to leave some space for questions and conversation. So this is a brief set of screenshots of the capability statements. So we outline the RESTful API basically by profile. So for the profiles that are in AU Core, that's an old screenshot. I'll need to update that. But it puts a summary table that says for a resource, allergy intolerance at the top, what's the profile that this FHIR resource has to conform to? And it provides the canonical URL of that AU Core profile. And then it says from the RESTful API perspective, you support read, you shall support search. And it's got nothing at the moment in the update, create columns. And it lists the search parameters that are expected to be supported and some other like operations and includes on the right. And then we also go into detail for each of those resource types, and you get what that second screenshot is that is shown here for patient, which provides some much clearer detail on what is required. We'll look to have an information session and go through that in more detail at the moment, but that calls out, again, what the search parameters are, and it provides some of the documentation on what does the client have to do, which of those parameters are and why, what are the interactions. And it also calls out things like reference policy and do you have to implement this resource? And do you have to implement the profile? Is it a shall or a should? For patient, it's shall for both at the moment. So I'm going to move on to what does AU Core in release 1 cover, noting we're about halfway through that development of it. So we've got some of the scope drivers for our first release. And here's what we're focusing on. The key one is obviously AU-CDI, our Australian core dataset for interoperability. That is coming close to release for comment, which will be the 8th of February. There's a draft that's being finalised now for that purpose. And that is driving AU Core and AU Core R1. There are also a number of use cases of interest to the community. They are concepts for a health summary, transfers of care of different kinds, and e-requesting. Noting the other project we're going into working on is national e-requesting. Some of our other scope drivers have been the particular interest or needs of the members of the technical design group from an interoperability sense, and looking to our national and international specifications of relevance, US Core, International Patient Summary, and International Patient Access. And those are all overall driving what our R1 looks like with the great scoping mechanism of time. We only have a certain amount of time to work through for a first release. AU Core will go through yearly releases, as will AU e-requesting, as does AU Base. It's a standard HL7 Australia FHIR IG cycle. So at the moment, what we're looking at in AU Core R1 are some of the essentials that you should not be surprised about: patients and practitioners and organisations, allergy intolerance, medications. We're looking at smoking status because that has come out of a driver from the AU-CDI at this point. Some of the vital signs, some of the diagnostic result observations, not all of those, driven again by AU-CDI, which has some of those aspects in its first release. And then we've got sort of things in the middle ground where these are things that we want to include in release 1, but we're not going to be able to do all of them. There's already a significant scope for the first release to get through consensus and testing and into ballot. So we can only take some of these, and we're going through that refinement now on which of those profiles will be in R1 and which of those will end up going into R2 plus. Terminology. There's a lot of terminology in any FHIR IG. What I've done here is listed the value sets that correspond to an element in AU Core. So part of the AU Core data model in FHIR. So these are where they come from, and only the Australian ones. So I have not listed the value sets that are HL7 international value sets published in FHIR. So there's, based on our current scope of AU Core R1, there's a relatively significant degree. All of these are either defined in AU base or published directly in the National Clinical Terminology Service and then bound in an AU Core profile against an element that has must support on it. These are the currently supported extensions. The first one's in counter description, noting there's a change proposal to take that out of R1 at the moment. There's a birthplace, which is an international FHIR extension, Australian Indigenous status, which is an AU base defined extension. Interpreter required is an international extension. Date accuracy indicator is, I'm pretty sure, an Australian extension. And birth time is an international one. So in AU Core, we're referencing the extensions we need in order to represent the concepts. Most of these come from international. Some of them we've needed to define in an Australian context, particularly where they are Australian concepts, like Australian Indigenous status. I'll probably pause for questions there as well. Jojo?
Hi, thank you. I've got a question in regards to going forward with the subsequent later versions of AU Core. Is it the aim of this group that we always maintain a previous version of AU Core, so that if a jurisdiction or a provider is unable to migrate to the latest version, they can still maintain on the existing version, the current version, and then they'll continue to have the same service and follow the same FHIR protocols and rules? Whereas, if a provider picks up a later version of FHIR or AU Core, they'll have some more functionality and more capabilities because that's allows on the later versions. Would that be the aim of what you're trying to achieve as well?
It is. The versioning strategy and what our needs are hasn't been fully defined. All releases will be, I guess, permanently available. So they will always be, like they are for FHIR itself, permanently linked. And it's about, I guess, the community or who you're exchanging with as to what version you're using that defines the rules by which you're exchanging data or conforming to. That may become something that is, to a degree, government directed. One of the things I missed in the earlier description around Sparked is the government has funded and initiated the FHIR Accelerator, and they have signalled that FHIR is the future, that's what they want, and that they are looking to mandate AU Core. We don't have any specific timelines on that, or what does that exactly look like, but they are looking to some of the compatriots overseas, things like what the ONC has done in the 21st Century Cures Act in the US, around how do they mandate essentially the work that's happening now around AU Core and AU CDI. So there's always the potential, I guess, that the direction to have a particular version or conform to it will have some tie-in to those aspects.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up question to that. Is there a reason why the core and the capability portions of FHIR protocol is segmented or split up? Is it an architectural or technical constraint? I'm just wondering, it's just out of curiosity, just trying to understand that separation.
Do you mean why do we have server and then client as two separate capability statements?
No,
or
Sorry, I understood the core as a sort of like the mandatory data set that we need to be sharing and sending, whereas capabilities adds a little bit more functionality. So is it more of a technical constraint that you want to keep those two things separate in the messages that we're using with FHIR?
A good question. So they're both in AU Core.
Okay.
So the data model is represented through the profiles. More helpful. Here we go. So the data model is represented in the profiles, and the behavior is represented in the capability statements. They're both in AU Core, but for some use cases, systems aren't exposing a RESTful API. They may just be a data store, they may be something else, and there's a need to support an understanding of, I just have data. That's all I do. How can I say that I implement AU Core? So that's why we've got those two separated.
Okay. If just follow-up question to that, if we are using RESTful APIs, does that mean that as a client, I can query or inquire with the server about how a test is called, or pathology test is called in that server's domain? So if, for instance, if I wanted to place a pathology electronic order, but to an external laboratory, but I want to know what that test is called because it's not called the same thing, does that mean that I could potentially query that and then find out what that test is called and then send a message with an order to say, this is the test I want from you for this patient? Like, are we talking about that sort of level of complexity? You're thinking about that?
Not in AU Core. It's possible in FHIR to do.
Okay.
But AU Core being the minimum, no, I think that complexity is well beyond what AU Core should be defining.
Thank you.
Which was, okay. So I'll just do a little bit quickly through where are we now with AU Core, which is obviously at a draft stage. We've got a set of profile candidates for R1. We've got some things where we're trying to go, can we fit this in time or not? We've got a set of capability statements and we're working through refining those down. They'll be in this slide pack, some links to how you can have your say if you want to provide your feedback on what is in the first release of AU Core, and particularly how do we implement AU CDI, because part of what we're working through is how does that logical element, so AU CDI, for example, has something called sex assigned at birth. How do we say that happens in Australia? How do we exchange that? That needs to be mapped into AU Core R1. So there's a set of proposed both AU CDI elements and how do they get implemented in AU Core available that we're looking to come to agreement on by the end of February. Other things we're working on in February are particularly the gender harmony adoption. So we've got a set of proposals coming through that are looking to adopt in AU Core the items out of the HL7 Gender Harmony IG, which include things like pronouns, which include things like gender identity, recorded sex or gender. And so they're coming through into the AU Core design group for us to discuss and agree on, well, does that in the first place form part of AU Core? Is it really a minimum requirement in Australia for us to support that? And if it is, do we do it in R1? And that's some of what we're working through. The other things we're coming to have some discussions around are kind of finalise how we're dealing with encounter, immunisation, and vital signs. And any other, I guess, feedback that's coming through as people look to and read through and review the specification and raise items. I'm actually going to skip past that and talk about our milestones. So February is when the AU CDI will be out for draft for comment, and March will be the first release of AU Core ballot for comment. And that's going to be put out through HL7 Australia to ask for feedback on that. With the timelines for R1 then going June is when the AU CDI will be published, so incorporating all that feedback. And then August, we'll go out in AU Core. So we need to follow and have AU CDI finalised, because AU Core is the exchange standard for AU CDI. And when that has been finalised, we're going to ensure that whatever we need to change is incorporated in that, and then release ballot for a standard for trial use for Australia in that AU Core, and work towards a publication deadline of January 2025. It's a standards process and things take a while. And then we're back onto the next cycle. Here's some exciting and upcoming AU Core TDG meetings you could be part of if you're interested to do so, where we're going to be talking about Encounter this Friday. And then we're going to go in and have a consensus meeting on that on next Thursday, and also talk about gender identity and pronouns. Following that, we're getting into immunisations and vaccination administered, and going through the parts of AU Core that have that. Right into then some of the other gender and sex aspects of sex assigned at birth and recorded sex and gender. And we just keep moving through things and ensuring we refine the specification, take that through the group. So how to contribute? Have you joined? Are you part of the group? Are you invited to the meetings? Do you want to be invited to the meetings? There's a link here on how to register. You don't have to have registered to come to any of the meetings. They are open Zoom links, just like this one. If you've got the link and you can see it on the Confluence page, then you can just click in at the right time. Please start checking out the Australian channel on chat.fire.org. This is where we're having a lot of the really interesting discussion. There's one going on now that is proposing a substantial change to how we support allergy coding in AU Core. Review designs. Put your specification feedback. You don't have to be part of a group. You can just read this and add your feedback, which can be things like typos, but there can be also things where you think the specification is unclear. Maybe it's overly prescriptive or too constrained. Maybe it's missing something that you think really needs to be included. All of that feedback is welcome, and we do go through all of that as a technical design group. If you want to contribute and you're of a technical mind, you can create a pull request on AU Core. It's all open source under HL7 Australia. So anyone can raise issues and also contribute to fixing issues. And then we get into our more organised events. We've got Connectathons. There is one coming up in March for everyone on the line on the 20th to 22nd. I don't think the Eventbrite links will be out yet, but we will be coming to Sydney. It's Sydney, 20th to 22nd, and going through and testing AU Core. Oops. This will be where I made a mess of the slides. Okay, questions? Sharing at this point. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Hi, Danielle. I was just wondering if you're able to share the link to the AU Core GitHub. I saw that you're looking at posting some of the operations for us to do some pull requests and just test conceptually.
Sure. So, yeah, in that chat, Dushi's just supplied the AU Core GitHub source.
Thank
and
you.
Can you also add in there what the current draft of, like where to find the current draft of AU Core, like when it's continuous integration build. Thank you. Okay, excellent. That's now in the chat. Okay, any other questions?
A comment. I found that very clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I might stop the recording here anyway, and if there are any other questions, people can, I mean, you can still continue to put your hand up, and if there's anything